So, Workbench. So what I did is I was like, what am I going to do about Workbench today? And then I remembered something I had explained to people before, and I was going to bore everybody with it because I could just see, is, we talk about different sewing machines, and we've always talked about the mechanics of it. And one of the things is, currently, Japanese sewing machines are the best sewing machines. It used to be that European sewing machine. Well, they still are. I mean, Bernina's, Fafs. And they got me thinking about something. One of the reasons that the Japanese do such a wonderful job with embroidery machines is because they have become consumer electronics. They are no longer the mechanical beasts that they used to be.
This is true.
Which is why a lot of the European brands, and I'm not knocking Germans, I love German engineering, but they're tend to be more mechanical gears and that sort of thing, whereas the Japanese and the Asian markets are more known for their consumer electronics. And so that's one of the reasons why you're going to find higher end stuff. That's why the Japanese machines really own the embroidery market. And as an example of this, what I actually did is I went through the parts catalog, because one of the things that I find fascinating is how many motors are in an old sewing machine?
One.
Old school. Yeah.
$10 GC.
Yeah, and that's one of the big differences. An old sewing machine up until probably about 15 years ago. One motor. There's one motor. You pull it apart.
When it's broke, it's broke.
It's broke. And all the old ones, like the Singer Featherweights, the motor is just bolted to the back. One motor. But what's interesting, do you know how many motors are in a Luminaire?
8.
I want to say 2.
I
Two?
ruined your surprise.
I'm going to say 4.
You have talked about this before.
Yeah.
I was going to say 7, but
Yep.
I know it.
Actually, I went through the parts catalog just to figure this out. I actually counted up. I actually did
Oh wait, no, it's much more than
Yeah, I
4.
pulled up the parts and I did a search for motors.
Yeah.
8.
There are 6.
6.
6 motors. You've got the main drive motor.
Wowzer.
And then you've got 5 other pulse motors. It might be actually more than that. But those are the ones that came up when I did a search for motors. Sometimes they have a abbreviated MTR, and I didn't think to search for that either. But you have at least 6 motors in there. You've got a motor that drives the belt, which drives the sewing mechanism. You've got a motor that does the zigzag stitch. You've got a motor that does the feed dogs. The feed does the feed dogs. You've got a motor that does the threader. You've got a motor that does the bobbin winder. So you can see why, when you think of an embroidery means as consumer electronics, it really changes how you're going to view that versus a sewing machine. Mm-hmm. It's got more. A new machine has probably more in common with your iPad than it does its predecessor. Now, even the PS500, the lowly PS500, the entry-level sewing machine we sell here, has 3 motors in it. You've got the main motor. You've got a pulse motor for your zigzag,
right.
And
Interesting.
Bobbin.
and then there's a feed, another feed. I think a cutter motor. You've got a motor for the cutter. But so that was just kind of the workshop I just wanted to get into the Workbench today, was keep that in mind. The modern machines have a bunch of different. What's funny though is, of those 6 motors in the Luminaire, I would say 5 of them are the same motor. They
just do different things.
They just do different things, and they have different pinouts on them. But they use pretty much, and that motor is honestly, that motor, I think, retail on that motor, I want to say is $8.
Wow.
Just to keep that. So it's not like, oh my gosh, I got all these motors, it's more expensive.
Right.
It's actually a lot less expensive, because you can just throw that motor in there, which it's a I don't want to say disposable, it's an expensive motor, versus cutting all the gears and doing all this fancy mechanical stuff. And that's the big difference between a modern machine and an old one, is that they've gotten away from all the mechanics and have replaced them with electronic parts.
Right.
For better or for worse, and whatever. Some people would argue that that's.
Sometimes when the electronics are unhappy, it's really
frustrating. But that's like I said, that's why a lot of your like I said, your top embroidery machines are coming out of Japan, because consumer electronics are modern sewing machines are consumer electronics. Mm-hmm. They are not the home appliance that they used to be.
Cool.
So that's the Workbench for the day.
Nice.
All right, back over to you, Becky.